Hi, Juan Pablo. Thanks for joining me on Lead Time Chats today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Let's just dive right in. So, the topic we wanted to talk about is just this topic of like becoming a manager, becoming an engineering manager at a high growth startup, and what that experience is like. Often there's no guardrails, very little support. So, what are the common pitfalls and mistakes that people make when they're in this position, and then how might they avoid them?
Right. Um, this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart because I found myself in that situation many,
Let
many
me
times.
guess, you were there.
Yeah, and I was there at the time where I was like, I'd never want to be a manager. I just want I want to write my code and just leave me alone and don't talk to me.
Mhm.
And it eventually like just completely flipped. It's like, okay, I'm gonna throw myself in because it seems so. So the first thing you probably should know if you want to become or if you have become a manager in startup, if you want to work at a startup, is that startups are not places where you get people with a ton of management experience. Early stage startups, right? It is unlikely
Mhm.
that someone who has a ton of management experience, specifically engineering management experience, will join an early stage startup unless they either founded it or they're lucky as range to have someone like you, for example, right? Um, but we know like it's not having managers of any range, even the
Mhm.
separate, is uncommon. And so most common pitfalls that I found myself in was dismissing the need for management, right? For someone who is focusing on specific problems that that are different from engineering, right?
Mhm.
But have huge impact in engineering, right? Specifically around the goals and the impact of the goals of what we're trying to
Mhm.
achieve, right? Early stage startups are like burning cash, trying to learn really, really fast or faster than the market. Um, and decision making at where to devote that engineering effort is
Mhm.
critical for whether you're like spending. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a startup that chose to use uh, Kubernetes in a really complex
Mhm.
way to deploy their their environment. And I asked them how many users they have. It's like, oh, we're not live yet. It's like, well, that's why, right?
Mhm.
That is a management decision that someone should be making at some point, right? You have technical leadership, of course,
Mhm.
but it
Mhm.
is a business decision of where to devote some of that attention. And so one of the first pitfalls is dismissing management, dismissing the importance of managing management very early,
Mhm.
and over indexing on how cool it is to learn with new technologies, which it is
Mhm.
super cool and it is super fun. But our responsibility is not to use someone else's money to learn, right? At least
Mhm.
not on those angles.
So there's
What if
this like rush to deliver or build or execute, and so like funneling all your energy towards engineers doing stuff rather than getting some alignment or some leadership or management up front and making the right decisions.
being yeah, it's sort of like stewarding impact, right?
Mhm.
Which is it's hard to do without authority, right? You
Yeah.
have to either be very influential,
Mhm.
especially in early stage startup. You have to be extremely influential to say like, hey, look, either I have all this experience already,
Yeah.
which again is unlikely,
Mhm.
or yeah, like be very, very good at laying out the ground on why you should make certain decisions that will positively impact the business, because that's what we have to always come back to. Like we're a
Mhm.
business. To be fun and cool, and we're locking in ties and things, but we're still trying to produce business outcomes.
So if you're an engineering, so say you're in that environment where like the general vibe is, deliver, execute, work on these cool things, but like, you're not live, but you're kind of hiring, you're burning through cash. If you were to become an engineering manager in that kind of environment, what are the challenges you might face?
Well, that's a, that's a great question, such a difficult one, and also brings many. Um, One of the first questions, one of the first challenges you'll face is if you've never been a manager, the
Yeah.
trust from your peers, from your former peers, or from your team on like, all right, well, like, why are you the boss now, or why are you suddenly in charge? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I had to do that, right? The first time I became manager, I was sort of like promoted, or not promoted, because we know it's not a promotion, but I was given the role because I kind of took it, right? I was like, look,
Mm-hmm.
this is a mess. Let me, and I had to lobby all my peers, like, hey, look, this is a mess. This is a mess. I can help this. Like, give me a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I earned the trust, and they were like, cool. And then that gave me more trust. But that's one of the biggest challenges. The second
Mm-hmm.
big challenge is when, especially in startups, is when we start running against our early startup infrastructure, or lack
Mm-hmm.
thereof, right? Where we wrote the code because we had to go live, and it's what we call a lot technical debt, right? We made all these
Mm-hmm.
decisions for the sake of finding product market fit, but finally suddenly we get there, or our product, or we've reached the limitations of the expansion of our product, and we have to take care of these things. And lobbying or influencing the organization to sort those things out is really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Learning how to have the right language, because sometimes we'll start saying like, hey, there's technical debt and we have to rewrite this, but why? It's like, we have to rewrite, it's like we can't do
Mm-hmm.
anything,
It'll be better.
and it'll be better, and yeah, we're going to take 3 months of do nothing, but it'll be better and we'll do more. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
and that software is very unintuitive. It's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. Why? um and so learning how to translate from the business to
Mm-hmm.
engineers, like, hey, yes, look, let's find balances on how to not rewrite everything, or migrate, or start from scratch, or greenfield, these things that sound super cool but not not often succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, be able to talk to other business leaders, and give context into why this is important, and without even talking about um, the technologies that are underlying. No one needs to know about microservices or services, or whether
Mm-hmm.
Postgres. It's outside of the business. Like, hey, look, um, we need to invest in our website, because the loading the loading, this is one I use, the loading time for our landing page is 7 seconds. You
Mm-hmm.
want to invest all this money in growth marketing, which is going to go straight to the drain, because everyone is
the
going to
the 7 seconds.
right.
Right.
And so we need to do all these very complex things with some of our front end technologies, so that we can reduce that time. And there are shortcuts, but it'll impact the experience. It'll impact
Right.
many things. We'll make the decision, but the ultimate goal is so that that money that you're investing in growth marketing can go
Mm-hmm.
really, really far, and so our product can advance further. We don't just want to play with new versions of whatever the latest front end framework is. There are decisions, and that is also why focusing on the business goals, despite, yeah, we're going to play with cool stuff for
Mm-hmm.
nerds, or at least I am, um and we like learning, and we're motivated by learning, but the confidence management is done through that, right? That we're always keeping the business in focus, and we're talking about business outcomes, because that's how we get out of those sort of cycles. So like, hey, all you want to do is just invest in infrastructure, and invest in infrastructure, and invest in
Right.
infrastructure. When do we get like product or business? Like, it's not a us versus them. It's like together.
Yeah.
So
It,
that's one thing.
it seems like there's one part that's like the pitfall is not communicating well, but then it seems like to communicate well, you also actually need to have a pretty comprehensive knowledge of the business, of where, like, how engineering, how the stuff fits in, right? You need to know, like, oh, this 7 seconds, they're putting a bunch of money in growth marketing. That's just going to go down the toilet because people are going to get to the 7 second loading and then drop off, right? Your conversion
Mhm.
rate's going to be like close to zero. And so, how do you like? I think especially as engineers, a lot of IC engineers don't need to have that information for a long time, right? They kind of have it already, things are vetted, things are like already have buy-in from other business leaders by the time they're working on it. So like, how did you find, like, what was an effective way for you to start gaining this like knowledge of how the business worked, how all the different functions fit together?
Right. So we're touching a really key part, which is, in larger companies, you can maybe get away with not really understanding the business or the levers of the business, because you can be working
Yeah.
really far from it, right? In some extent.
Right. You've
But
got
in
a
startups,
PM, you've got an engineering
right,
manager, you got a director. And by the time it gets to you and you're implementing stuff, it's like decided. That's the thing. That's the
right.
thing.
Yeah. And if you do want to advance in your career, then one of the ways that you do it is you learn about those things. But in
Yeah.
startups, you're kind of forced, right? And
Mhm.
one of the most illuminating moments for me is like when I started having the language, like the cost of acquisition, the
Mhm.
lifetime value, the cohort, like when I started just spending enough, like the same time as I was reading about JavaScript frameworks as about how businesses, or the early stage businesses work, and watching perhaps yeah, like different growth, reading about market fit, reading about other
Mhm.
things, it gave me superpowers, because then I was part of the business, right? I was representing engineering, and I got invited to places where engineering should always be,
Yeah.
um, but isn't, because sometimes these teams are set up as consulting agencies, right? Like your
Right.
internal consultants, like, hey, we know how the solution looks like, so just build it for us. And yeah, you can build it with whatever cool stuff you want,
Mhm.
but this is how it's supposed to look like. And sometimes that works, right? When you're trying to replicate someone else's business model, or you're trying to do sometimes, yeah, solutions can come
Right.
out of that.
You have something that you know has product
Mhm.
market fit, for example.
Right. But I've learned that having engineers closest to users, closest to the problem, is what really changes the game, right? It really
Mhm.
puts people like, okay, so here's the business problem, here's how users are impacted, and here's,
Mhm.
like, with all my technical chops, what I can actually do to change this. I can sometimes, yeah, I'll build an admin, or we can use this like an Airtable here with an API, and it'll give you like a lot of um, a lot of flexibility. And
Mhm.
so, yes, on one end you have the pitfall. Not understanding in the business is a common pitfall for engineers as a whole, right? We
Mhm.
are really overly obsessed with software
Yeah.
for a reason, right? That in some
Mhm.
cases, um, it's what drives us to keep learning and keep reading and keep. But it it creates a blind spot on
Mhm.
why software is so powerful, why building software is so powerful, and why it can be so impactful, um, with similar effort.
Mhm.
Um,
What other pitfalls or common mistakes have you seen kind of like first time engineering managers make in these situations?
I think, well, the first one I always like telling, the first mistake I made the second day I was a manager was I committed my team to a deadline without talking to my
Oh.
team. Right? That's like,
Popular. Yeah.
I was like, last week I was saying like, no, this is too much. We're not gonna hit it. Next week, of course, absolutely. We'll like, oh my. Those are common, but but another common one. Well, one of the challenges is as an engineering manager at a startup is that a lot before Camille's book, The Manager's Path,
Mhm.
a lot of what we learned about management was through oral tradition, right?
Yeah.
Like being in companies where someone kind of knew how it worked, and when like managers
Mhm.
who knew migrate to other places and then sort of like seeded this, but it was an oral tradition.
Mhm.
Um, and so not looking at the manager's path as a
Mhm.
career, as a side, it's a completely different set of skills that you need to develop. Is a common pitfall, right? Because
Mhm.
we sometimes default to things that are really easy for us, right? Or comfortable. And when we're first time managers, it's really comfortable and easy to stay
Right.
close to the code, to make technical decisions, to not delegate all those things. But we are now responsible for the people who are in our team and their growth, and that
Mhm.
they understand the business and the way that we should understand the business, that they're actually solving those problems. So
Mhm.
instead of spending an hour writing code, maybe you spend an hour learning about the business, right? Those are
Mhm.
the trade-offs that you're not making. And separately, there's a whole series of roles that stage startups don't hire for, that you still need to build an effective organization, like HR,
Mm.
like talent acquisition, like, and so if you want to be effective, or how I've been effective is taking a lot more of those hats, especially when I'm thinking about building well represented organizations, and maybe either traditional HR consultancies aren't going to meet me there. So I'm going to like set some of those policies myself,
Mm.
or set out a sourcing strategy, be
Right.
out there recruiting, and that becomes my job, especially if we're
Yeah,
growing really quickly.
it
Go
sounds
ahead.
particularly challenging because if you're growing into this role, it's not like you're growing into it at a huge company where you have your manager telling, giving you mentorship. There's maybe like internal management training, there's other, peer groups. You're kind of thrown in and you have to put on all these other hats that are maybe beyond what frontline engineering manager would do at a larger company. So you're kind of doing a lot more.
You have no blueprints, you have no
Yeah.
support, um, you probably have no peers, or peers in this similar situation,
Right.
um, and you also have a range of folks likely reporting to you with broad set of experiences. Some who have been with good managers, some who have never had management, some who have received feedback, some who haven't,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really really hard. Right, being a manager at a startup is much harder because you don't count without that support framework, and you don't know what you don't know,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're just getting started. And so even fighting support is very tough.
What do you find effective for folks like that, where they don't maybe like, a lot of high growth startup, the founders are not known to be great people managers, right? They're like they're product or
Yeah,
tech people
makers.
who don't, yeah, they're makers and
Yeah,
they certainly can't mentor a new manager on how to be a good manager. They haven't yet hired anyone. That's why this person is being kind of pushed into management. So like where does someone like that find support or help?
so there's a couple of places. Well, of course, I hope they're watching this, because this is the first. this is
Mm-hmm.
a, this is a great first introduction to this, and I know you've written a lot about management, and so there's a few resources, right? Lara Hogan has written a lot about also like management and manager support. You have Camille's book, The
Mm-hmm.
Manager's Path. There's a few online communities or Slacks where
Mm-hmm.
people can join and start at least finding what they don't know, like
Yeah.
throwing out questions like, yeah, I'm lost, and we'll get a lot of support. One of those is the Eng Managers
Mm-hmm.
um, Slack, run by Kate Huston, and there is the Lead Dev community as
Mm-hmm.
well,
Yeah.
which a ton of writing, and there's events. I will say that anytime folks are reading about anything related to management, the context of whether this is at a large company versus not really really matters, because a
Yeah.
lot of the writing, a lot of the when you get a chance, like, yeah, well, look, here's how we did it at Airbnb or Stripe or Medium or all these places.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, you're already big and you had people who knew come and set up stuff. If you're a 20-person company, it's a very different
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, you may be
And
a first-time engineering manager and have to create a hiring process, create a, comp system, leveling, right? Like those are all things that you could be a senior director at Google and never have to touch at all, right? Like,
never, not even like, I was surprised, right? I joined Stripe, is like, okay, how does what, you never talk compensation? I'm like, what? I don't, what? I had to set the bands for like, um, and so yeah, like keeping that in context is really important. Also, finding cohorts of people who are in a very similar position, right? Because then you start finding folks who have been there, who have solved some of those challenges, and collectively you can start solving those problems together. I don't think there's enough support though for managers in this space. Before we didn't have support for managers at all. Now we have a lot of more
yeah,
material
eng
for.
management
Mhm,
material, right?
mhm,
But
yeah,
it's generally like there's leveling systems, there's kind of more structure set up for those. I mean, the resources there are kind of not not with the assumption that you're kind of in a high growth startup with no guardrails and no support internally.
Right, and
Yeah.
especially if this you've seen this happen in software, right? It's like, well,
Mhm.
Google has a monorepo. Okay, we're gonna do monorepo. We have a Kubernetes or whatever.
Right.
That happens with management too, and there's a famous case,
Mhm.
right? Spotify. Spotify came out with this squads and things, and everyone was
Guilds.
like, "Oh
Yeah.
my god, we have to." Everyone in small companies without context
Yeah.
went all the way in to try to get it, and like, "Oh, this matrix management makes us slower, and why is this happening?"
Mhm.
And it's because, well, no one, like, Spotify hired the person who invented agile coaching, right? And they
Mhm.
had all this infrastructure, and tiny companies don't have that.
Yeah. So it sounds like
And
one pitfall is uh like cargo culting things from other companies without thinking critically about, is this appropriate for our company at this stage, and kind of trusting your own instincts as just like a, someone with common sense and judgment, and just, yeah, like not just taking things with no context, or like critical thinking.
correctly, yeah, correct. Like,
Yeah.
context matters a lot. The
Mhm.
the outcomes. It's not we're doing this because Spotify did it. It's like, why did Spotify? What
Yeah.
outcomes they're looking for? How does that relate to the problems we may have or not? And then
Yeah.
what are the pieces from there that we can learn from? Because of course that is extremely valuable. Both
Yeah.
learning about, that's how we all advance. But it's being a little bit more critical around why we're importing these processes, because
Hmm.
ultimately
Yeah,
process is
getting
what we
just
do.
clear about like what is the problem, like what is the problem the company is facing, and then how will this address it, and probably
Mhm.
that would, even then, you just, when you're writing it out in a doc or something, you're just like, oh, do I have any reason other than X company did it, right? Like,
Mhm.
starting to be more critical about adopting these processes.
It's being taking a product oriented approach to your process, right?
Hmm.
And piloting and experimenting and
Yeah.
evaluating lightly
Hmm.
whether it works or not.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much. I think this will be really helpful for engineering managers, and also just people running companies, fast growth or high growth startups. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, and good luck to everyone.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Find some support,
Yeah.
external resources.